Hello and welcome to this session on Kipling's My Own True Ghost Story. So in this session I'm going to continue with the close reading of the story and talk about the implications of the principles of the Imperial Gothic on this particular story. I want to begin by showing you this picture of the dak-bungalow, because the dak-bungalow is a crucial character almost, or setting in this particular story, and what happens within the bungalow in fact drives the plot of this particular short story. And I also want to point out that the dak-bungalow becomes symbolic of the British government itself. If you remember the story, our narrator, our English narrator, is inside Khansamah dak-bungalow, and this bungalow was a very solid one, but the partition walls of the rooms were almost jerry-built in their flimsiness. I want you to think about these two words. Every step or bang of a trunk echoed from my room down the other three, and every footfall came back tremulously from the far walls. For this reason, I shut the door. There were no lamps, only candles in long glass shades. An oil wick was set in the bathroom. So Khansamah dak-bungalow is not a very comfortable rest house. It's old, it's dirty, it's grimy, it's perhaps full of bed bugs and mosquitoes, and the ancient steward there is also not very sane. So that is the premise of this particular story that we saw from the earlier session. And now we are introduced to another important aspect of the dak-bungalow, which is that the partition walls, the walls separating the rooms, if you remember, each room is leading into another room. So there are three rooms tagged on to, attached to the room in which, or kind of adjacent to the room in which the English narrator is resting for the night. And he points out that the partition walls of these rooms are flimsily built. They're not very solid. They're not solid, they are flimsy. So as a result of this flimsiness, every step, every noise that occurs in all these rooms, the three rooms which are adjacent to the narrator's room, can be heard very clearly, and you can almost hear every footfall which comes back tremulously, shakily. Tremulous, you use this word tremulous to talk about someone who is frightened. A tremulous deer is something that comes to mind when you think about this word. Somebody who is extremely timid and jumpy. So that sound is coming, but the sound of the footfall is coming back in a tremulous fashion back to the narrator. And of course there are no lamps, there are just candles. Once again, this is very interesting because in the red room we saw that there are no lamps but candles, and candles take us back into the ancient medieval world. Not make us think about late 19th century. So in this context, since this is India, perhaps all these technological advancements of electricity hasn't come into this dark world. So that could be the suggestion there. And the narrator goes on to further heighten the misery that he is experiencing in this dak-bungalow, and he points out that for bleak, unadulterated misery, that dak-bungalow was the worst of the many that I had ever set foot in. There was no fireplace and the windows would not open, so a brazier of charcoal would have been useless. The rain and the wind splashed and gurgled and moaned around the house, and the toddy palms rattled and roared. Half a dozen jackals went through the compound singing, and a hyena stood afar off and mocked them. A hyena would convince a Sadducee of the resurrection of the dead, the worst sort of dead. So there's a lot of detail in this particular passage, and these details build the atmosphere of this particular spot in India, and it is an atmosphere which is very hostile and threatening. It's almost unwholesome as well. So let us pick on those words which connect this particular passage with other narratives of the Imperial Gothic. Bleak, if you remember the lecture on Imperial Gothic, you would understand that bleakness of setting is associated with such narratives. The colonial worlds are bleak, gloomy, and therefore they are threatening and dangerous for the health and safety of the English man. So here he also points out that this is the worst bungalow that he has ever stepped foot in, and there is no fireplace, he points out, and which means there's further darkness, and the windows can't be opened, the windows are stuck. So this is again a Gothic motif. And since there is inability for the narrator to open the windows, we get the sense that he is being imprisoned almost in this particular bungalow. So the idea of incarceration is brought forth indirectly through the faulty windows which are not able to be opened. And he says that a brazier of charcoal would have been useless. A container, brazier means a container for holding hot charcoal, is not of much use because obviously there is no fireplace. So there is lack of warmth, there is lack of light. And what is outside of this bungalow? The wind and the rain. So again, the weather is also not very conducive for the happiness and comfort of the narrator, and the weather is also against the comfort of this particular narrator. And the rain and the wind splashes and gurgles and moans. Look at the word moaned, which is very interesting in the context of this Gothic story, because at the beginning of the story we saw a variety of ghosts being listed out, and who are haunting the passageways of the Indian roads. So moaning immediately makes us think about all those hauntings, and the toddy palms, the trees, kind of rattle and roar in the wind. They are being buffeted, the fronds are being buffeted by the wind, and that is also adding to the eerie sound of the ambience of the environment around him, around this particular narrator. And further, there are also hostile, dangerous animals such as jackals, and a hyena is also standing about mocking the jackal. So again, hyenas and jackals, very cunning animals. If you look at the attributes that we human beings have given to these animals, we see jackals and hyenas as being merciless, the hyena especially as being very relentless in its pursuit of the prey. So these are the creatures that are being picked out for depiction by Rudyard Kipling in this particular story. And further, he says that this hyena would convince a Sadducee of the resurrection of the dead. Sadducee is a sect that doesn't believe, a Jewish sect that doesn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, but this hyena is so persistent and apparently very convincing that it would make a Sadducee believe about the resurrection of dead people, the worst sort of dead. while the narrator is describing the elements that are outside of the bungalow, the Khansamah, the steward, the servant, is preparing the food, and he comes in with the Ratub. And if you remember the previous lecture, the Ratub is the word used for dogs' rations, and not used as the word for food that's being eaten by that's eaten by human beings. So the Ratub, this man continues that metaphor of dogs' rations further along in the story, and he points out that the Ratub is a curious meal, half native, half English in composition, with the old Khansamah babbling behind my chair about dead and gone English people, and the wind-blown candles playing shadow bo peep with the bed and the mosquito curtains. It was just the sort of dinner and evening to make a man think of every single one of his past sins, and of all the others that he intended to commit if he lived. So I want us to think first about this meal, half native and half English. It's a hybrid meal. And you can see how this ancient steward is able to absorb the English dish and combine it with the native recipe in order to produce a kind of a compound meal. And the interesting part is that the narrator points out that this man is almost barbaric, and a man who is senile, who has lost touch with reality, who lives always in the past. So it's a contrast. It's a kind of a surprise to see this man come up with a hybrid meal, which is combining all the various characteristics of two different ethnicities' dish, and offer it to the narrator. And he talks about, the Khansamah talks about dead and gone English people, and while he's doing that, the candles are playing shadow bo peep. It's as if it's playing a game with the shadows and the mosquito curtains. So this dinner is a kind of an eerie dinner that this narrator enjoys, and he thinks that it is a night that would make one think about all his past sins, perhaps because he thinks that his end is near, and he also wants to think about the future sins that he may commit, because something dangerous is perhaps going to happen in this particular night in this particular bungalow. Sleep is not easy for him because of all the mysterious threats that are running through his mind, and further the room is also not very comfortable. The lamp in the bathroom threw a most absurd shadows into the room, and the wind was beginning to talk nonsense. So he is personifying the wind here, and the wind in this native country can talk only nonsense, unreasonable, unrational stuff. Not rational affairs. So again, we can see that the wind is also described according to the author's or the narrator's beliefs about the local populace and the country. And the lamp is also throwing a lot of shadows, which reminds us of the red room, where we have the shadows overwhelming the narrator, the young narrator. Now, it is at this point we have the entry of the Doolie-bearers. So, just when the reasons were drowsy with blood sucking, I heard the regular "let us take and heave him over" grunt of Doolie-bearers in the compound. First one Doolie came in, then a second, then a third. I heard the Doolies dumped on the ground, and the shutter in front of my door shook. "That's someone trying to come in," I said. but no one spoke, and I persuaded myself that it was the gusty wind. The shutter of the room next to mine was attacked, flung back, and the inner door opened. "That's some deputy assistant," I said, "and he has brought his friends with him. Now they'll talk and spit and smoke for an hour." So as the narrator is having his meal and observing this old man Khansamah mutter about the past, he also thinks that this is going to be a really bleak and horrible night. And then as he is about to retire for the night, he hears some Doolie-bearers come in. He is able to figure out from the words used by the Doolie-bearers to find out the identity of these new entrants. So first one Doolie comes in, then the second, then the third, and he can hear the Doolies being put on the ground, and the shutter of the door is shook by that sound and by that pressure, and he realizes that they are going to stay, and he realizes that he is also going to have an occupant in the next room, and he believes that it is a native assistant, a sub deputy assistant, and that's him with his friends, and they are going to talk and spit and smoke. Spit is very interesting here in this context, because spitting is apparently an uncivilized behavior that is associated with the natives, and the English narrator believes that he is not going to get his rest because they are going to chat and spit and smoke at least for an hour. I'll continue in the next session. Thank you for watching.